All around him, Daniel Shays saw poor farmers like himself, many of whom he had served with in the Revolutionary War, now being sent to rot in debtors' prisons. Families were left without providers, and mothers were forced to beg in the streets.
He had been taken to court for debts twice by different retailers. So Daniel Shays was afraid that he was going to lose his land, he was going to lose his crops, lose his cows, and so on, and he couldn't support his family at that point.
To lose your farm and to have to work for someone else was more than just an economic decline. It was a decline in your status in your country. That is, you would no longer be a voter. In order to vote in most colonies and in most states, you had to prove that you owned land. This made you an independent man.
And here you have an interesting situation of the complete insensitivity, the blindness of a political elite. The political elite that governed Massachusetts were for the most part centered in eastern Massachusetts. They were oriented towards the sea, towards commerce, towards business. And indeed, there was a wide cultural, economic, and geographic gap between eastern Massachusetts and the western part of the colony.
Shays began to meet frequently with his supporters at Conkey's Tavern, inciting them with talk of self-government and rebellion.
It had been a tradition for decades and decades, maybe centuries, to have demonstrations by the people when they felt that there was some economic inequity or some invasion of people's rights as citizens by people in power. Shays' rebellion, in a sense, comes out of that tradition.
Shays had convinced his fellow farmers that something had to change. During the summer of 1786, all over western Massachusetts, conventions were held to determine a list of demands that were to be delivered to state government leaders in Boston. Because Boston was both the center of industry and also the major port, the state government was largely composed of wealthy lawyers, merchants, and property owners.
The Eastern establishment turned a deaf ear. There were protests. The rebellion that erupts in 1786 and 87 did not come as a great surprise. There had been lots of little bits of evidence and suggestions that the people in the West were unhappy. But the Eastern establishment ignored that. And they went ahead with their program of taxation. That is, taxation to raise the money, to pay the state debt, and to make the necessary contributions to national government. In the meantime, ignoring this rising chorus that was coming up from the more rural areas of Massachusetts.
As a prominent figure in the Eastern establishment, Samuel Adams had vowed to stay out of politics after the Revolution. But the temptation was too much, and he eventually ran for state senate. He won, and was soon elected Senate President. One of his first acts was to call for an end to the county conventions.
County conventions are not only useless, but dangerous. They served an excellent purpose and were highly necessary when they were set up. But no more!
The irony of Samuel Adams's career after the American Revolution is that the very techniques that he pioneered, the very strategies that he developed, the very tactics that he employed were now going to be used by, one might almost say, his students. His students being now the farmers in western and central Massachusetts. They began to organize in meetings of protest, in county conventions, in town meetings, in all kinds of activities that mirrored exactly what Samuel Adams had been doing in the 1770s. The difference now is that Samuel Adams, the great agitator of the 1770s, the great organizer of resistance, now in the 1780s, looks upon these people in resistance and is horrified, absolutely horrified.
It can never be the duty of one man to be concerned in more than one revolution.
But Daniel Shays and the farmers of western Massachusetts didn't agree. They were indeed concerning themselves with a second rebellion. They had tried the way of conventions, petitions, and letters to their elected leaders. They had tried to seek justice legally, and they had been ignored.
They viewed lawyers and they viewed judges in the same way as they viewed the Eastern politicians. These were men out to suck their blood.
Shays still had no way to pay his debts to the businessmen of eastern Massachusetts, and was faced with the threat of imprisonment, crushing poverty, and the loss of his farm. To feed his family, he had been forced to sell his most cherished belonging, the sword he had received from the Marquis de Lafayette. Fortunately, Daniel Shays still had one sword left, the cutlass he had carried in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And now he sharpened it again in preparation for a new battle. In the late fall of 1786, Daniel Shays began to muster and train an army. Among them were many of the men he had fought with in the Revolution.
The Massachusetts veterans of the Revolution who joined Shays' rebellion put the hemlock in their hat when they went off to war to fight against British tyranny. I mean, it was symbolic. This is the new tyranny that they're fighting against.
The poor and oppressed of Massachusetts had desperately needed a leader. Now they had one, Daniel Shays.